Hey everyone, I'm Jessica Hiatt, and I preached this sermon at our church on Sunday, and the video didn't get saved. So I'm coming to you live from my living room, and we'll see how this goes. It's going to be hard to do without the whole congregation. So Mount Hood stands 11,250 feet above the Columbia River in Oregon. Its snowy peak can be seen for miles and miles in every direction. Whenever we go to drive to Portland, we always wait and watch for that first glimpse of the mountaintop, hoping that it's not covered in clouds. Climbers flock to Mount Hood. More than 10,000 a year climb the peak and reach the summit. It's the most climbed glaciated peak other than Mount Fuji in Japan. 130 people have lost their lives attempting to climb Mount Hood, which is in the last maybe 150 years. So why do it? What is it about climbing a mountain? Well, there's something about that mountaintop experience that just draws our eyes and our hearts upward. Adventure awaits. Life on the flatlands and in the valleys just isn't enough. We long for the high peaks because they change us. Our passage today contains a mountaintop experience. Our story today is from the book of Mark, chapter 9, if you would like to turn there with me. And this transfiguration narrative is in the middle of this gospel, and it represents the turning point in Jesus' ministry. Up to this point, he's been teaching and healing, but then from this time on, he's traveling towards Jerusalem, where he's going to face crucifixion. I'm going to read Mark 9, verses 2 through 4, and I'm reading out of the Amplified Bible. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured, changed in form before them, and began to shine brightly with divine and regal glory. And his clothes became radiant and dazzling, intensely white, as no launder on earth can whiten them. Elijah appeared to them along with Moses, and they were having a conversation with Jesus. Why these three? Why Peter, James, and John? Maybe they were Jesus' favorite. Or maybe they were the ones who were always in trouble, and Jesus took them with him to keep an eye on them. Whatever the reason, these three went and climbed the mountain with the Lord Jesus, a party of 4 climbing towards the summit. The name of the mountain is not given, so it must not be that important. It's the what that is important, and not the where. We have the makings here of an epic and great story. 4 friends determinedly making an arduous trek to the top of a mountain. No fancy climbing gear here. They probably had on sandals and robes, maybe a walking stick. At least there was no snow or ice. Legs and lungs were burning. Conversation had stopped, and the only sound was crunching gravel and labored breathing as they got closer to the summit. But then they got there, and suddenly Jesus was transformed like a true superhero right in front of their eyes. Metamorphosis right there, no cocoon required. Otherworldly bright light was emanating from their usually fairly normal friend. Did it happen slowly as they watched, or was it just in a flash? I don't know. Either way, it would have been terrifying. So there was Jesus, burst clear out of his earth suit, shining with the glory of God, with the glory of his true heavenly self. And if that's not enough to constitute a mountaintop experience, 2 more appear. Moses and Elijah dropped straight from heaven in for a chat. I'm going to continue reading now, verses 5 through 7. Peter responded and said to Jesus, Rabbi, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 sacred tents, one for you, and one for Moses, and one for Elijah. For he did not really know what to say, because they were terrified and stunned by the miraculous sight. Then a cloud formed, overshadowing them, and a voice came out of the cloud. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him and obey him. So now, Peter. Oh, Peter. What was he thinking? He always says what the rest of us are thinking but are afraid to say. Terrified or not, he knew what he was seeing, and he knew that it was good. Very, very good. And so he wanted to hang on to that moment and keep it going for as long as he could. So he blurted out the first thing that came to mind. Let's build some huts and let's stay here forever. But mountaintops don't work that way. Seemingly in response to Peter's rash suggestion, a dense cloud enveloped them, and a voice, the voice of God, boomed forth. I'm going to read verses 8 and 9 now. Suddenly they looked around and no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus alone. As they were coming down from the mountain, Jesus expressly ordered them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The mountaintop experience is over. It's time to head back to the flat land or the valley. Eyes aching from Jesus' glory, ears ringing from the voice of God, and now they're having to walk down the mountain, hips hurting, knees hurting, and they can't even talk about it. Mountaintops are exhilarating places to be, even without these superhero-ish events. Your legs are talking to you, and not very nicely. Your lungs are burning with the effort of constant uphill. But up on the mountaintop, the view is exhilarating. The air is different than down below. It's fresh and clean, cold and crisp. Those achy muscles let you know that you've done something truly worth talking about. The experience we have on the mountaintop is something we want to hang on to. We don't want to leave. It was hard getting here, so let's stay for a while. The glimpses of glory that we see make us want to grasp and hang on, because the alternative is to go back downhill. Life is like that. We prefer the mountaintop experiences, the good things. We long for them. But mountains and valleys, the highs and lows, are part of being human. God works through both to transform and change us, to sanctify us. In my life, there have been some powerful experiences with God that happened on the mountaintop, but much of my growth has happened in the flatlands and in the valleys. I may have tried to capture and hang on to God's glory, much like Peter wanting to build shelters and live there with Moses, Jesus, and Elijah. But God's glory cannot be grasped and stuffed into a box that we design. Though God's presence, power, and strength may be more easily seen on the mountain, it's just as strong on the flatland and in the valley. We want our walk in life to be a straight line from point A to point B. But I'm sure, as in my life, and I'm sure all of yours, what I've encountered is more like a ball of yarn that kittens have gotten a hold of. When my son Jonah was born, that was a mountaintop experience. God was good, and all was right in the world. No mommy was ever so enamored with her little tow-headed baby boy as I was. Doesn't everyone say that? He was perfect in every way. When Jonah was 4 months old, we took him to Firebird Raceway with us, which is a drag strip that's located not far from where I live here. And the cars were so loud, the funny cars, that my insides were vibrating and my ears were ringing. And there was Jonah, sleeping peacefully in his car seat. I had been on the mountain, but after that day, I tumbled and rolled into a valley of worry because I was sure that my sweet baby couldn't hear. Up there on the mountaintop, Peter, James, and John had been in a thin, skinny spot where God's dimension and the earth dweller's dimension meshed together. It was a terrifying, terrifying moment, one that dear Peter tried to hang on to. He wanted to grasp it and contain it. Peter, he had the audacity to interrupt a conversation between the transfigured Christ and the heroes of the faith, Moses and Elijah. Maybe the church needs to have more Peters today. Believers who are so fired up and all in with being honest before the Lord that they aren't afraid to go after him with everything in them, seeking the Father's face and his voice. That's what Peter was after. And he heard the voice of God from the cloud proclaiming that Jesus was his son, his beloved. This was God's grace. God knew what was coming in the future after the disciples and Jesus walked back down that mountain. He knew that they would be descending from the top of the mountain and that their whole world was going to be turned completely upside down by Jesus' arrest, crucifixion, and death. From the highest of highs to the lowest of lows. The disciples' lives were not an easy point A to point B either, and neither are ours. But the God who never leaves us on the mountaintop also never leaves us when we're on the flatland or we're in the valleys. God is continually seeking us out, working in our lives, shaping and forming us in his image. Or the big word is sanctification. So it turns out that my blonde, blue-eyed baby boy was profoundly deaf. When we had the testing done, there were no limits, no response to the limits of the test equipment. So that mountaintop where we had been living turned upside down. But that was 23 years ago, and lots of hiking up and hiking down, and hiking up and hiking down in between. But through the experience of raising my deaf son, I learned a new language, I experienced a whole different culture, and I learned that I can always have confidence that God's acting in my life to transform me. Whether it's a good, well-watered time on the mountain, or whether it's a barren, desert time walking through the valley. Like Peter, I would very much like to build myself a house and set up a monument to the places where things are good and where God seems very near. I would love to live there all the time, on the mountain. But submitting to God on the mountain also means submitting to God in the valleys. Trusting that he is in the business of transformation. Trusting that he'll never leave us on his own, but will use the mountaintops to give us glimpses of his glory, and that he'll bolster and hold us up with his strength when we're in the valleys. So what situations do you have in your life now where you either need to rest in that mountaintop experience, realizing that that's gonna change in the future, because change is always a part of life. Thank you, and hopefully I can get this one uploaded. Bye.